Hello and welcome back to the Keto Summit. I am here with Dan Pardi. Dan is an entrepreneur and researcher who has focused his life's work on making people feel awesome. Dan, thank you very much for coming on. I'm delighted to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and the type of research and the tools that you've been building over the past, 5, 10, I'm not sure how long.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It's an honor to be here, Chris. I'm really as I told you offline, I think that this subject is actually perfect format for a summit because there's a lot of interesting work. It's an exciting time, and it's really great to get a diversity of opinion and perspectives on it. So yeah, thanks for including me. And I've been interested in health my whole life, and in graduate school, where I got a degree in exercise physiology, I was exposed to work on energy regulating systems and leptin. Leptin was just recently discovered mid-90s, and the lab that I was working in was looking at how leptin could modify blood pressure. But it is a subject that has really captivated my interest for quite a long time, probably also because I was dealing with weight issues since when I was young. I was an obese kind of early teen, and I've always wanted to really solve that issue myself. And so I've explored a lot of different strategies over the years. And so it's kind of a mixture of, scientific interest, career interest, and personal interest all mixed in. I worked in sleep in the pharmaceutical industry for almost a decade. I ran a research grant program. And during that time, I got to interact with really some of the top sleep leaders in the world on a daily basis, which was great. And now I do research at the departments of neurology and endocrinology at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and the behavioral sciences department at Stanford and the Jamie Zeitzer lab, circadian biology lab. So my interest looks at how ecologically relevant amounts of sleep loss, which means not missing an entire night, but missing just a couple of hours, how that can influence decision-making on food choice, and also how it affects hormones like ghrelin and leptin, things like that. So very, very much an interest in feeding behavior and energy regulation. And then also I'm also extremely interested in behavior and, the different factors and forces that shape how we live and what we do. And so I developed a behavior model and turned that into a tool, launching that tool as Human OS in a couple of weeks. And that is aimed to try to help people perform better, live longer, resist disease, and really generally keep your body functioning at peak potential. So that's, kind of a cross-section of all my interests. And yeah, happy to talk about, this. This is one topic that I'm absolutely still learning about, but I have investigated certain aspects of ketones and ketogenic diets more deeply. So happy to talk about that today.
Excellent. I've really been enjoying your Human OS radio podcast that people can find on iTunes, and Stitcher and Overcast is my favorite app at the moment. That's a really wonderful podcast. And you've been focusing just on interviewing professors. So people are really at the top of the level of expertise in their field. And I think it's wonderful that you have access to those people and they're willing to give us what they've learned. So yeah, highly recommended, Human OS radio. And of course, you're active on blog.dansplan.com as a writer, a technical writer with lots of references. And I think you do a really good job of making that information accessible, but you write at a level that certainly I am not capable of. So people should check out those resources. I'll link to those in the webpage that hosts this video so that people can find them. And thank you so much for that work, Dan. We really appreciate it.
I really appreciate that, Chris. And that is a big goal. I'm a little more comfortable writing technically, for like a journal article, but I do that for an article. I write almost what would be more of a scientific article, and then I actually go back and I try to translate it.
Yeah.
So as though I was speaking to, somebody who doesn't have necessarily a background or expertise in the subject, but is interested, and I try to tell the story to them. So it's a two-part process for me.
It's a valuable process because most people watching this video or your audience will be fully capable of thinking critically and logically, but they may not have the same vocabulary, and that could be a stumbling block that prevents them from learning as quickly as they otherwise would. So I think that translation process is certainly valuable.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I, always striving to, continually get better at it. And there's this curse of knowledge that Daniel Kahneman talks about, which is this idea, when you know a subject so well, sometimes you even forget what is more common knowledge and what's expertise or domain knowledge in terms of art. And so I really try to really switch hats and say, okay,
Right.
is this term, does it mean to, to the reader what it means to me? And so it's good to kind of really put yourself in another person's shoes and think about it from their perspective.
Right, right. And so today we're going to focus in on the ketogenic diet and ketones specifically for weight loss, which I'm sure many people watching will be very interested to hear about. And, this is one particular area where I don't have a great deal of personal experience. I've never been overweight. I've been lucky like that. But one thing that I have experienced is perpetual hunger. And when I switched to a ketogenic diet, suddenly I was able to maintain my body composition effortlessly. And that's important to me, not just for reasons of physical appearance or health, but also for performance as a mountain biker. There's lots of climbing, and if you have an excess of body fat, then you're never going to be competitive. So I would say that the ketogenic diet has enabled me to just not stop thinking about food. I can just eat and maintain a good body composition and not have to worry about counting calories or being hungry all the time and all that type of thing. And one of my favorite people in this area is Professor Richard Feynman, who has a book I very much enjoyed and whose name is escaping me now. But in the book, he says that a ketogenic or a low carbohydrate diet should be the default approach when you're trying to lose weight. Would you, obviously you have a great deal of expertise in this area too, and you've created lots of programs, including the Ideal Weight Program, for people to help improve their body composition. So would you agree with that statement that a low carbohydrate diet is the first thing to try when you're trying to lose weight?
Well, I'm not sure that I would fully agree with it, but I'm very optimistic about the potential of a ketogenic diet. And based off of some of the mostly appetite regulating evidence that we see. So I do think it is a very good diet for some. I've put some friends on it, just a story that I can tell. A good friend came to me 6 weeks before his wedding and said, "Hey, I need a little help." Put him on a diet.
Great example.
Yeah. And I didn't put him on the Ideal Weight Program diet that we've created. And I'll just describe some of the tenets there to talk about a little bit about the differences there, just so we can, have two things to compare. But for him, I thought it was a perfect diet because, one, I thought he could do it easily, given his level of interest and ability in cooking and his travel schedule, et cetera. He lost 18 pounds in 6 weeks.
Oh, that's awesome. Congratulations. Congratulations to him. That's phenomenal.
Yeah. And actually, it's funny because in parallel, another person came to me. They don't know each other. Same time. I put him on the same diet. He lost 18 pounds in that same period of time in preparation for Burning Man to try to get lean. So,
that's another great reason to look good naked.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it is one that I consider it a really valuable tool in the arsenal of options that are arsenal of good options that you have to offer to somebody. So would I say that it is the diet to start with everybody? I'm not comfortable saying that yet. Do I think it's a really valuable option that we have at our disposal? Yes, and I'm increasingly excited about the evidence coming out showing long-term safety, showing unique metabolic effects that might indeed actually prove a ketogenic diet to be the best diet for long-term weight regulation or weight loss. Now, do you have to stay on a ketogenic diet long-term? I don't think so. And evidence points to the fact that that may not be the case, but occasionally entering into a ketogenic state, particularly during a period where you're attempting to reduce body fat, might actually be one of the, if not the best approach to lowering fat in a sustainable way.
Okay. And then let's talk about what happened to those two people after Burning Man, after the wedding. And do you know what the scientific literature says about those people in general? What happens? Do they keep the weight off, or do they regain it, or what happens?
So because the world is the way that it is, with surrounded by a lot of options that will increase body fat, and because of other factors that are affecting energy regulating centers of the brain, sleep loss, inactivity, other things that might cause inflammation within energy regulating centers, then you can't always judge, you can't judge a diet, the value of a diet, by whether or not somebody gains weight necessarily afterwards. It's their potential to sustain that weight loss if they do the right things that I think is most interesting. Right? It's not a guarantee that you're going to maintain that weight loss forever. In fact, I think the more that you gain body fat, let's say if you gain and you lose and you gain and you lose, you might increasingly create a susceptibility to regaining weight again. Therefore, you have to really maintain good practices around lifestyle once you've lost the weight.
And what degree of fluctuation would you be worried about? Are you talking about, I mean, you see people on the Keto Gains Facebook group, for example, that are literally half their original body weight.
Yeah.
So that's obviously a huge change. But then obviously my body weight fluctuates quite a lot in a sort of maybe even a 10-pound range. So is that the sort of range that we're talking about, or how big does the loss have to be?
Well, I think so that's, it really depends on the individual, what their gender, their age, their weight history, and also their genotype. So we live in this multifactorial world, and people truly are different from one another. And so there's a lot of things that are going to impact the results. But what you typically see with somebody that successfully loses weight is they might, let's say, lose 10% of their body weight, but then regain back 5%, and then they stabilize. So there's some weight regain after weight loss. And then in a good situation, there's some stability that is achieved at a weight that is lower than what they started from. In a negative situation, there's some weight regain. There's a loss of control in appetite and over lifestyle behaviors that do influence the system. And then sometimes then weight can skyrocket back beyond the original baseline point. But there are real differences between diets, and this has been shown in some work that I've written about. There's a study by McNay and Speakerman that I think is extraordinarily interesting. It's in animals, but they're in rodents, but I still felt that it was very illustrative of something that we see in humans as well. That if you can control calories, you can lose weight on a lot of different diets. But some of those diets are going to predispose you to rapid weight regain, where others are giving you a better chance of maintaining that weight loss after once you've achieved it. And that's what's interesting to me. So now some people feel like the amount of weight loss that happens with a ketogenic diet is fairly effortless. And that in itself is someone might achieve the same amount of weight loss on a different diet, but it was a lot harder to get there and then a lot harder to sustain. So you can't necessarily just judge a diet by the amount of weight that's lost. That's one point. Yeah.
Absolutely. So can you talk about some of the differences between those diets that you just talked about, where some, were more likely to keep the weight off?
Yeah. Well, you have, in this particular diet, what they did is they made mice obese on a high-fat diet. So a diet that induces diet-induced obesity. And once they achieved that state, they they put the different animals onto different types of diets that were calorie controlled. High protein, high carb, a ketogenic diet, and then a high fat but not ketogenic diet. And they reduced their calories to 70% of calories during baseline. So they were in a calorie deficit. And all the animals lost almost the same amount of weight. So that's one point, right? At this point, it seems like all diets are equal. Then what they did is they looked at what happens 6 weeks after they go off of that calorie restricted period. And the animals that were on a ketogenic diet had maintained a lot of the results. Animals that were on a higher carb, low fat diet and a higher protein diet actually did fairly comparable. So they had gained a little bit of weight back, but not all of it. So ketogenic diets seem to be the best. But again, statistically, it wasn't a massive difference. And high carb and lower fat and high protein also were good. What wasn't good was a high fat diet, but that was not ketogenic. And in this animal model, they had gained a lot of the weight back. And then what they did is they actually sacrificed the animals, and they looked at something called this proliferative remodeling of neurons within the lipostat, or the fat regulating center in the hypothalamus. So we should probably talk a bit about this because it's really fundamental to what's happening here. Because there's different ways that you can look at what's happening. Is there a metabolic advantage where you're burning more calories within one of these diets?
I love you, Dan, because you interview yourself. You're asking all the right questions that I was going to ask anyway.
All right, good. Just trying to make your job easy. And then there is, so that's the, right, is there a metabolic advantage? And then, or is there an influence from the kind of the internal effect that the diet is having on the fat regulating centers? To me, it's that second question, which has always been more interesting. Even if you were to accelerate the amount of calories that are being burned, that could actually predispose a better condition for weight loss. But ultimately, in my opinion, things come back to is what is happening in the brain to affect then, are you allowing your body to feel comfortable at a reduced body fat level? Mm-hmm. So body fat is the body fat organ is controlled almost like temperature is in the body or in a room. It's called the lipostat. So neurons within the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus and other areas of the hypothalamus and other areas of the brain are sensitive to leptin, which is this hormone that is released from fat tissue. And it's released proportional to the amount of stored triglycerides in the body. So the more fat you have, the more leptin you release. Now, this travels up into the brain, it can cross the blood-brain barrier, and the arcuate nucleus is sensitive to that. And then leptin is actually influencing this. Imagine a seesaw. And on one side of the seesaw is what you call orexigenic neurons. Orexigenic neurons are promoting feeding, and they're promoting a decrease in energy expenditure. So that program or that system is really designed to increase the amount of fat that's on the body. That's one side of the system. On the other side of the system, you have anorexigenic neurons, and those neurons are doing the opposite. They're suppressing feeding and interest in appetite.
And wakefulness as well. Am I thinking of the same neurons?
Well, now there's a lot of crosstalk between different cell groups within the hypothalamus. The arcuate nucleus is not known to affect wakefulness directly.
Okay.
But there's other areas of the hypothalamus, like the ventrolateral preoptic area. Higher activity in that area will actually induce sleepiness. And then areas, the central wakefulness organizing center in the brain is an area of neurons called hypocretin or orexin. It's actually the same chemical, but it was identified by two different labs at the same time. And so it goes by, it's one of those situations where, it's so funny how that happens quite often. There are these discoveries that take place, which, kind of makes sense because people are always working off of the same body of info. So
right.
The chances of new discoveries happening simultaneously is pretty high. And in this case, that's what happened. So one group named these neurons orexin, and if you think about it, it sounds like orexigenic. And the reason why is because when they would inject orexin into the what's called intracerebral vascularly, so they actually just inject orexin directly in part of the brain, it would promote feeding. And they thought, these orexigenic neurons are directly promoting feeding in the central nervous system. What they then later, some criticism said, yeah, but you know what? What do mice do when they're awake? They move around and they try to look for food. So is it actually a feed promoting neuron system, or are you just increasing the time that they're awake? And when they're awake, they look for food. And so that was some criticism, early on. But yeah, there's a lot of different crosstalk between these different cell groups of the hypothalamus, and this area of the brain is incredibly important for maintaining balance of a lot of different kind of automatic subconscious processes in the body: heart rate, blood pressure, body fat level, temperature, things like that. even sexual activity. And so, yeah, and one of the ways that they actually will affect these different systems is there's different ways that these cell groups can affect your physiology.
Okay. So go back to the study. So they sacrificed the animals and they found that there were changes in this area of the brain. So what did they find?
Yeah. So they found that the mice that were on a ketogenic diet had what's called proliferative remodeling. And I'd kind of gone off on a little bit in the tangent there, but let me explain that. So this balance of orexigenic and anorexigenic neurons are, it's really important that they both are somewhat equally stable, right? So if you imagine that the orexigenic neurons are stronger than the anorexigenic neurons, then what would that mean? That would mean that systems that decrease energy expenditure and promote feeding are overwhelming the areas that are supporting the opposite. And if you think about this concept of a set point, is that the area of the hypothalamus is collecting, the hypothalamus in general is collecting signals both internally and from the environment, and is then trying to maintain homeostasis or balance. And when you have some issues or some imbalance in some of the strength of these neuron systems, then what happens is that you can actually elevate your set point. Now your body's going to try to be regulating balance around a higher level of fat. And one idea of what's happening with an elevated set point is exactly that, is that you damage some of the neurons in the arcuate nucleus, and you cause, and I'll talk about how that, why that might happen. And then therefore, your body, you were 175 pounds at 13% body weight. Now you're 195 pounds at 18% body weight, and it's really hard to lose the weight. Your body doesn't let you get back down to where you were. And so that is what's going on within the central nervous system, in part to explain that phenomenon. So if you think about it, any amount of weight loss, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to teach your brain to be more comfortable at that level of body fat that is lower than the heretofore previous elevated set point. You want to make your body comfortable at a lower body fat level. And how to do that has been really, really tricky. Ketones might be one of the ways in which to do that. And the reason I say that is because there's this idea of proliferative remodeling means that these neurons, these orexigenic and anorexigenic neurons, are always remodeling. New neuron formation is constantly taking place. When you induce diet-induced obesity in animal models, that amount of new neuron formation is suppressed. One hypothesis is that it's suppressed, that new neuron formation is suppressed more in the anorexigenic side, the side that is suppressing feeding and energy expenditure. So that's problematic. That's going to cause your set point to rise. And so that's what we see with diet-induced obesity. When you actually induce weight loss through calorie restriction alone can be a bit stressful to the body. It's a stressor. In some cases, you actually see that it does enhance, calorie restriction alone can enhance this remodeling, which is good. But only to a certain point. That's why some people can lose some weight, but not more, right? A certain degree past that becomes extra stressful, and then the body resists it. So when they looked at this remodeling across the different diets, what they found was very different results. And there was a certain degree of remodeling with the high carb and high protein, but there was even more remodeling with the ketogenic diet. And the high fat diet, on the other hand, suppressed remodeling. And that matched perfectly with the results of the weight regain. So in one case, you lost, in a high fat diet, you lost weight. It was stressful to the body, and you gain the weight right back.
Okay.
And, yeah.
So so are you confident that this model would translate into humans?
Well, I think that you have to look at the body of evidence, right? And if you look at it, the rodent models in humans is actually very compelling. It's very compelling. It's been argued that they're not a good model because there's a lot of variability, genetic variability, looking at the conditions of their environment. But that same thing holds true for humans, right?
Of course, yeah. A metabolic ward chamber is not real life, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what do we know? Well, we know that both rodent models and human obesity they show very similar things. You see insulin resistance, glucose intolerance. You see that the islets of the pancreatic beta cells experience hypertrophy. There's leptin resistance. There's hypertension. So you see the same phenotype being displayed in rodents that you do in obese rodents that you do in obese people. There's a inflammatory activation of different tissues. Your actual fat organ is inflamed, your brain is inflamed. And so the similarities are robust. That's one line of evidence. Another line of evidence is when you take an obese mouse and you put it and you do gastric bypass, the actual effects are almost identical to what you see in a human that undergoes gastric bypass. So, there's decreased food intake, body weight, improvement in glucose homeostasis. You see an increase in GLP-1 and PYY and bile acids. There's also very specific changes to food and drug preferences. So yes, there's a good amount of overlap, even though they're not identical.
Okay.
That's one line of evidence that says, okay, this actually seems to be a very good model, which is surprising since we diverged from rodents, tens of millions of years ago. It just means that some of these pathways are likely have been evolutionary conserved from humans to rodents. That's what that suggests.
That's very interesting. And talk to me more about the high fat diet. So,
Yeah.
I spoke to some people, notably Tim Noakes, for this summit, and I'm pretty sure, I hate to kind of misrepresent people by accident, but I'm pretty sure that he thinks that most of the benefits of a high fat diet come from the high fat diet, and that measuring ketones is perhaps a step too far for the vast majority of people, and that they don't need to achieve ketosis, as in blood levels of beta hydroxybutyrate above 0.5 millimole, in order to achieve effortless and sustainable weight loss. But the evidence that you're presenting here would say otherwise, and that perhaps measuring ketones and achieving that level of ketosis and maybe measuring the ketones to make sure would be important. Do you think that's true?
Whenever we talk about, one thing that I think is so important in physiology and actually in so many other things in the world is to not group large subjects together and talk.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we should. Yeah, I mean, we should assume. Perhaps you should better describe the two people that came to you that you talked about at the beginning of this interview. Like, so otherwise healthy, feeling good. I talked to a guy actually right before we started this interview, and he feels great. He sleeps well. He's happy. He's training. His only complaint is body composition, and then specifically, he has belly fat he can't shift.
Yeah.
So he wants weight loss, but that's really what he's talking about, is he wants fat loss.
Right. Well, what I was actually speaking of is not necessarily that people are different, but that fat types are different.
Okay.
Fat types show very different effects. Polyunsaturated, monounsaturated,
of course,
fatty acids. Even then, you can't talk about all saturated fatty acids as though they are one monolithic class having the same effect. It's kind of like saying drugs do this. Well, wait a minute. That's such a big class. Which drugs are, they're having vastly different influences on the body.
So we do the same for amino acids. We just say protein. And then the same is true for carbohydrate, right? You could be talking about fiber, you could be talking about starch, like it's still carbohydrate.
That's right. We're talking, this week we're working on a blog on artificial sweeteners. And even then, that's easy to say. Artificial sweeteners do this. Actually, it really depends on the artificial sweetener.
The molecule.
Yes. So what do we see from the evidence? It seems that certain long chain fatty acids may be problematic, palmitic acid in particular. And why do I say that? And by the way, this is the types of fats that are stored in the human body in our adipose tissue.
Right. So this is one of the most common saturated fats that you find in any animal food. Am I right in thinking that?
That's absolutely right. So you find this in dairy and meat products, less so in fish and marine animals, and there you see more polyunsaturated fatty acids. So it's more, meat and dairy. Now, there is evidence that saturated fatty acids can be inflammatory. And you see this PK theta signaling, which is a marker of inflammatory activity in the hypothalamus. And this has been shown in rodent models, but then work done by Thaler at University of Washington showed that it had very similar results when looked through radiographic studies. So looking at imaging in the brain, there seemed to be similar signs of inflammation that were taking place. So now you have, again, it's easier to start with mechanistic studies looking at rodents, test it out, and then you find, okay, what seems to be what's going on here? And then you do a follow-up study and get the best resolution that you can within humans. And overall, you can't judge guidance to do any one thing off of any one study. You've got to look at the body of evidence, see if it lines up, see what you can learn from it, read the tea leaves. It's challenging. There's no really
that's funny.
Yeah. There's really no clear, direct way to get there. You have to it's the art of science, right? It's your approach to it, and then trying to make some, your best guess to help folks. And that's in a moving target as well, talking about human diversity. So, it's challenging. So some people might be able to tolerate saturated fatty acids, long-chain saturated fatty acids from animal products better than others. Probably those that might have a long lineage of having higher animal fats in their diets.
And is there a way for people to know? Is there some test I could do? Could I look at my genotype with 23andMe, or could I do a blood test and know?
Yeah, increasingly we're going to see nutrigenomic information where you can get your genes assessed, and you could look then at your propensity, if you have this genotype across these different genes, the FTO gene, ones that are affect fatty acid metabolism, then you might get an indication about what fat types are risky for you and where you might actually do better. And that's why we always see diversity even within a study. If you do a waterfall plot and you actually graph the effects of every individual, then you see some people there's averages, which is interesting, but then there's the individual, and some people on a diet, for example, like a high carb, low fat diet, they might, the average weight loss across a year might have been 5 pounds, but several of those individuals might have lost over 30 pounds, and some of them might have gained a few pounds, right?
That's another of Richard Feynman's favorite phrases that he uses, is that nobody loses an average amount of weight, right? Who cares about the average?
I mean, I do care about the average because it does suggest a couple of things. You just need to look farther. You don't stop there. It doesn't mean that it's good for everybody. If somebody loses 10 pounds, if let's say one diet beats another, it doesn't mean that's good for everybody. And it doesn't mean that it's bad for everybody too. So that's, more data should be presented that way, I think, actually. So now going back to this Noakes idea about it's actually the fats and not the ketones, I don't really think that that's true. There's evidence to show that monounsaturated fats seem to be healthy for the hypothalamus and its inflammatory state. There's signs that saturated fatty acids are having a negative impact on that, and there's multiple lines of evidence, human and animal, that suggest that to be true. And then what else? And then we also know that ketones in particular have a really interesting effect on a variety of different systems. In fact, it is the ketones that I think is what's causing this difference. You see that what accompanies a ketogenic diet on a hypocaloric diet, you have decreases in ghrelin, which I think we should definitely talk about, and also decreases in subjective appetite. And what's going on? Well, if what are the mechanisms there? If you look at ketogenic diets in models of epilepsy and neurodegenerative diseases, you see that there is decreased hypothalamic inflammation. You see decreased leptin resistance, which is exactly what you want. So there might be this resetting of the lipostat. And this might be due to, again, factors that have been observed in other models: decreased inflammation, decreased reactive oxygen species, increases in antioxidants, reversal of mitochondrial dysfunction, favorable action on different energy sensing pathways like sirtuins and AMPK, and mTOR, which is the mechanistic target of rapamycin. All of these pathways are sensing energy and then are making, biochemical adjustments to how energy is processed and managed. So, there's really good signs that ketones are having a favorable impact on the brain. And you might not actually need to remain in ketosis for a long period of time in order to reap its benefits. And one of the most interesting, compelling studies for me I love looking at the mechanisms, but I love comparing that to, well, what do we see in clinical trials? When you put it into a real world situation, what do we see? And there's a study by Paoli where they had people lose weight. They put them on a weight loss diet, and it was a multiphasic weight loss program. So they had them do a ketogenic diet for 20 days, a low carb diet for 20 days, and then a Mediterranean diet, a high carb Mediterranean diet for 4 months. They did that for 6 months. And then they repeated another 20 days of ketosis, another 20 days of low carb, high fat, and then another 4 months of a high carb Mediterranean diet. Now, typically, and maybe I can show you this on the slide because there's a really good slide that shows. Okay, can you see this here?
Yeah, I can see it perfectly.
Okay, I wish that I had an example of a typical weight loss situation. Now, can you see my cursor as well, or just?
I can, yeah, I can see your cursor.
Okay, so typically what you'll see is some weight loss within the first 6 months on any diet. Now, a low carb diet tends to be a little bit better, but you're talking about, 1 or 2 kilograms more than a low fat diet. So it's not, again, these are averages, and so it's not massive differences, but it's consistent. You see it consistently that there is more weight loss.
Yeah, and is that true of any study? So not to get too off track here, but it was one of the criticisms I heard made of Kevin Hall's latest study was that, there's always some kind of observer effect when you put anyone on any kind of diet in any study, they always lose weight in the beginning, even when you try and keep the calories sufficient for that to not happen. It happens anyway. And so do you think that's a thing, or is that perhaps just the opinion of one particular writer?
Well, that is it depends on the length of the study. And when I'm talking about 6 months here, where you actually do see a reduction in weight at about a 6 month period. Now, if you're talking about a 1 week study, a 2 week study, 8 week study, shorter the time window, then it's harder to know what you're really looking at and seeing and where the effects are coming from. Mm-hmm. And again, you're just reading the tea leaves and you're trying to piece together a variety of different evidence points to understand, really what's going on. But yeah, I'm not exactly, sure if I totally understand that being a criticism of Kevin Hall's work. I mean, his work was really interesting, and, we could talk about that now if you want. It's, what they were looking at is what they call clamped or controlled calorie intake, protein, and energy expenditure over a 2 month period. The first 4 weeks of that 2 month period, they had people on a kind of higher carb, pretty high sugar diet. 25% was from sugar. And then they actually had them go on to a ketogenic diet, 80% fat, 5% carbs. And they looked to see if there was any metabolic advantage. And earlier on, when we were talking, I was saying, hey, that's actually has been less of an interest to me, but still really good to explore. And what you did see was there was a rapid loss of about 4 pounds right away. But then that was with weight. And that probably had to do with some water loss dynamics, which is something that I've written about previously.
Right. So glycogen is stored with water.
Yeah, exactly. And so for every gram of carbohydrate that you're storing in your muscles and your liver, you're storing in it with about 3 grams of water. So when you purge the amount of stored glycogen, you're going to automatically lose some weight. And that weight loss can make people feel a bit tighter, and you can see some results in the scale, and it can reinforce, hey, low carb diets are good because I'm getting immediate feedback. That should not be underestimated as being a potent impact on somebody's motivation to continue. So that's really powerful. And it may or may not be indicative of actual efficacy of the diet, but it is having a very powerful impact on somebody's perception of its efficacy, which can have everything to do with how motivated somebody is to go forward, and how well they can adhere. Like if you think something's worth it working, you're going to stick with it.
Exactly. And then probably stick with it even if it stops working.
Well, yeah. And, that could be one of the problems actually of, and I read about this as well, that eventually a higher fat diet, for some people could be quite problematic, even if you get immediate results. For some people, going on to a higher fat diet, particularly if it's a high fat paleo diet, leads to a net improvement in overall food quality. if you, and even if you are, and there's different ways to have a high fat diet. If it's more Mediterranean in origin, in nature, versus a very high fat, high cream, high, meat saturated fatty acid style diet, then you could have very different results. One thing I should mention, though, is that diet is not the only thing that is influencing the inflammatory state of the hypothalamus, right? So is physical activity levels. In fact, physical activity can stimulate an anti-inflammatory markers that might be mitigating the inflammatory effect of saturated fatty acids, if there is one. And and therefore, and I read about this, is that if you are doing a high-fat paleo diet and you're doing CrossFit at the same time, you might experience great benefits from that dual combination, but you might experience very different results if you're on that exact same diet without exercise. Because
and so this is the key limitation of these nutrigenomic testing is you could sequence my DNA and say, oh, well, this is not right for you, Christopher, but they've no idea what I'm going to do with that information, right? I could sit on the couch in a windowless room as I am right now and not get any sleep, or I could be outside, walking and lifting heavy things, and that's going to make a difference.
Well, a lot of these things are really just talking about risk, right? So if you have a threefold increase in your your propensity to develop obesity with a high intake of saturated fatty acids, it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It just means that the risk is greater than somebody who has a different, genotype.
Right.
It doesn't mean that they could become obese and you could not, because of the other factors that are involved in the process.
Right.
Right. There's also the long tail of how how an influence, like there's an immediate effect of weight loss. We talked a little bit about that before, right? If you can control calories, then you can actually reduce body weight. But what is going on internally that might be predisposing you for later weight gain? You might have extraordinary success in the first 8 months with a paleo diet, but 2 years later, you're heavier than you would have been.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a real potential for some people with the right genotype, with also the right, I would say complement doesn't sound like a right word, but at the right other lifestyle factors that then are not kind of, suppressing the inflammatory markers that are taking place.
Mm-hmm.
So, to go back to the Kevin Hall point, the one thing I wanted to say is that they wanted to see if there was a metabolic advantage, and there didn't appear to be one in his 2 studies. So the second study, which was longer, the actual rate of fat loss slowed when the amount of weight loss was kind of maximal. So they lost those 4 pounds right away. If you looked at fat oxidation, then that actually slowed compared to the previous fat oxidation rate. But then it actually it kind of seemed to adopt the similar curve of fat loss as it did before. Mm-hmm. So even though you saw increases in fat oxidation, suppression in insulin, all the things that you wanted to see through the induction of the diet, it didn't lead to this metabolic advantage, which was hypothesized to account for, I think, somewhere between like 400 and 600 calories of additional calories.
It's never that big.
Yeah, that was what it was estimated to be. At the peak, the peak difference in the study was 100 calories more per day, which, hey, over the course of 7 days, that's not insignificant, but that was at its highest, and it dropped back down to, closer to the baseline level. So there just didn't seem to be the metabolic advantage.
So if you're watching this video, you should probably stop thinking about a metabolic advantage of eating a high-fat ketogenic diet, because there probably isn't one. And if it works for weight loss, it's through some other mechanism.
That's where I stand on the subject now, subject to modification of that idea with more evidence. I just don't know if it's going to be followed up on, given the fact that these were, well-controlled studies. They're hard to do. Having people in metabolic ward for a 2-month period is
doubly labeled water.
I mean, it's really hard. I mean, they weren't in the metabolic ward for the whole time. They went in every 2 weeks for a 2-day period, or every week for a 2-day period, I think, or 2 weeks for a 2-day period.
Mm-hmm.
But then they were kept in a environment where they had very high control over what they were eating. They watched what they were eating, so they knew what was going in and they knew what was going out. They had people on a cycle ergometer for 30 minutes 3 times a day, so they were controlling that. It was as controlled as it can be.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was a well-designed study. I think the criticisms of it were unfair, kind of straw man arguments, but it doesn't mean that a ketogenic diet doesn't have an effect. And in fact, one thing that Kevin Hall was really clear to point out in interviews that I've seen with him is that because, things like protein intake and calories were clamped or controlled, we couldn't really assess appetite. And that's where a lot of the evidence for me, a lot of previous researchers said, hey, there's an appetite advantage here. And that, I think, is really, legitimately true.
Mm-hmm. So go back to this study then. We confused the heck out of everyone. I apologize for that. That's me not being quiet. But Dan was telling us about this 2013 study, which is completely separate from the Kevin Hall study that we were talking about just now. So tell us what happened in this study, Dan.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, this is the study where they put people on a ketogenic diet for 20 days, low carb diet for 20 days, and then a Mediterranean high carb diet for 4 months. And they did that twice. So it was 6 months, then 6 months. And what you can see here in figure A is that from this T0, this is the starting place, they lost a majority of the weight during the ketogenic phase, the first 20 days. Then it leveled off a little bit, but there was still some weight loss during the low carb portion of phase 1. And then you start to see that, weight starts to creep up a little bit in the 4-month process, but that's not rapid weight regain. We're not seeing this rise back down up to, baseline. Then they did it again.
Oh, so tell me the difference between T2 and T3. What type of diet was that?
High carb Mediterranean.
High carb Mediterranean. Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I am really favorable on a Mediterranean diet. We're creating a course on it, and I've learned a lot about the diet. I think a lot of people know aspects of it, but it contains a lot of features that might be beneficial for a diet, regardless of you call it Mediterranean or not. High polyphenol intake, and actually, rather high intake in fiber and in monounsaturated fatty acids. And monounsaturated fatty acids have shown to be, neutral to beneficial on the inflammatory state of the hypothalamus. So that's great. I mean, here, if this, one interpretation of this might be, or speculation, I should say, is that you have a ketogenic diet that's having a positive effect on the inflammatory state of the hypothalamus, and it also is inducing weight loss. Then you go into a low carb diet for 20 days, you see a little bit more benefit, possibly through some calorie control mechanisms. Then you see a relative maintenance of that over a 4-month period with a Mediterranean diet. And that would line up with other evidence that shows that a Mediterranean diet is good for weight maintenance. Then they did the diet again, right? Another 20 days of ketosis, another 20 days of low carb, high fat. And now look at this. Now we're at T6.
Oh, wow.
This is 1 year later. And you rarely see this where somebody has dropped considerably from their baseline and they seem to be stable, right? And this is 4 months of, they're not having heavy control. They're not in a metabolic ward. They're just saying, live according to this style of diet. One of the benefits of the Mediterranean diet is that it's something that people can do. A diet is only as good as how well you can follow it.
Mm-hmm.
And, theoretically, the best diet in the world is no good if only 1% of the population can follow it. So there's something called interventional impact, where a diet that is, let's say, 50% is effective, but 50% of people can do it, is better than a diet that is 100% more effective, but only 1% of the people can do it. Right?
I would probably be that 1% that can still do it.
Well, there's always those that can, but it's the amount of, it's how many people can you really influence? And a Mediterranean diet is one that we know people can adhere to because it has adequate amounts of, rewarding principles that keep you, that say, I can stick with this long-term, no problem. So, anyway, this to me is some of the most compelling weight loss evidence that I've seen. And again, do we know really what the causes are? No, but we do see it's a great representation that this pattern seems to be effective. And actually, personally, this is one that I follow. I occasionally go into ketosis 1 to 2 times a year for about 8 weeks. I never lose any weight, by the way. But I always seem to gain muscle and I always lose fat, but my weight does not change a pound. It's crazy. I'm like, odd in that way.
Yeah, I think that's, one of the pitfalls here with weight loss is that people are obsessed with the number that they see on the scale. But let's face it, who cares about the force that your body exerts on the earth due to gravity, right? That's not what you care about. You care about the way that you look. You care about your body measurements. You care about your physical strength. You care about performance, maybe longevity, certainly. So yeah, I think the body weight can be really deceiving.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, so what is going on, and what is going on here? And one of the things is that a ketogenic diet might have a beneficial effect on the maintenance of resting metabolic rate, and also and which probably is due to the maintenance of muscle. And it's hard. That result has been equivocated by the fact that a lot of times a ketogenic diet also ends up being higher in protein. We know that protein has a thermogenic effect and also has a direct effect on the sensitivity and activity of the fat thermostat. It is an independent controller of the fat lipostat activity. So that's why up to a certain point, a high protein diet should probably be a part of most, if not all, weight loss programs, and also weight maintenance programs. And it is certainly a part of our ideal weight program.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, our ideal weight program, just to the one that Stefan and I have developed, is designed around high satiety per calorie. So the way that we typically eat is we eat till we're full and then we stop. It requires some maintenance to not overeat, which is easy to do, right? You're still full, but the dessert tray comes around and you want to keep going because your palate is renewed. There's all sorts of pitfalls like that in the world, but generally, if you can eat foods that help you feel full and satisfied, but tend to be lower in energy density, caloric density, then you might naturally be able to maintain a amount of calorie intake that keeps you lean. Mm-hmm. And also the diet is also high in properties that we think are supportive of the health of the thermostat. So we're both kind of keeping a really, strong eye on ketogenic diet with a lot of hope and optimism that it provides another great resource to help, solve this inscrutable problem. And maybe there'd be a combination in the future, but, right now, I feel like kind of the diet that we've created is very interesting, and so is a ketogenic diet. And
so this is the type of strategy that you would have somebody follow, if they were on the ideal weight program.
Yeah, we have two different diets. One of them is called a flash diet, and it is mimicking the most effective diet for weight loss that's in the literature, which is a protein sparing modified fast. In that case, you keep protein intake adequate to support lean mass, and you drop both fat and carbohydrate. So you're really basically eating protein and veggies, and you do that for 1 to 3 months. Then we have something called the simple food diet, which has more carbohydrate in it, and it's actually not a low fat diet. So you can have avocados and other full fat sources of food, but it's low added fat. So it's low in added fat and low in added sugar. And that's different than a low fat diet, which is trying to eradicate all fat from your diet. It's actually trying to eat foods in their natural state without adding a lot of excess calories, because it's easy to develop a caloric surplus by adding calories into foods that would otherwise be satisfying if you adjust the sensitivity of your palate, which absolutely does happen if you eat that way for a period of time. So that is, and it's possible that we're producing some ketones in a hypocaloric state. If you can naturally eat lower calories, you're having a reasonable fasting period between dinner and breakfast, you might be producing enough ketones to keep that proliferative remodeling of your hypothalamic neurons adequate, where you need it to be in order for you to drop your body fat set point in a manner that allows you to sustain a new decreased level of body fat.
Mm-hmm. I can't resist asking the question, it's just human nature. This chart, it shows me that the ketogenic diet was best.
Yeah.
Would more of the same be better? So if I was to keep eating the ketogenic diet, would there have been greater fat loss?
Yeah, well, we can't tell that. It's a great question. We can't tell that from this study here. There wasn't a comparative group that had kept people on that diet for longer. One thing that I've seen personally is that the ketogenic diet gives you rapid results that then actually do level out. Mm-hmm. And it's not like somebody continues to lose fat continuously, although some people have. But a lot of, I'm not sure what your experience is with this, but I see a lot of people will lose 20 pounds very quickly, and then it'll stall. And it actually could be problematic I've speculated on this before, that you do a ketogenic diet, you become a little bit lax, and you just go more to a low carb, high fat diet. And that I wrote a sentence that it might be darkest before the dawn with a high fat diet, where increasingly, if you're adding a lot of particularly palmitic and long chain saturated fatty acids to your diet, you could really be doing damage to your hypothalamus until you start to produce ketones. So really, depending on where you are with that level, it could be bad until it's the best. It's like a really biphasic, interesting response, not at all linear.
Right.
That could be happening. And then if somebody then goes into a ketogenic diet, they become a little bit lax and just are on a high carb, low fat, then you might be then all of a sudden shifting that internal hormonal environment to go, to regain weight. So instead of thinking carbs are bad and instead thinking ketones are good, then this diet, what we see here, makes a lot of sense, because you go from a ketogenic diet, really good for the hypothalamus and inflammation, to a high carb Mediterranean diet, really good for inflammation and weight maintenance. That might be a better combination.
Interesting. Yeah, my personal experience with the diet was when I first switched was measuring ketones properly, like above 0.5 millimole, which took me a while to figure that out. I lost a lot of weight, and I'm pretty sure a lot of that weight was muscle, because I saw it on the power meter on the bike, right? So my power at threshold just really went down a lot, even though I'd lost quite a lot of body weight. And I was actually the slowest on the bike I've been in a long time.
Was that while you were still doing a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, it was not, I mean, my body weight went down from 152 to 138 pounds at its lowest.
Yeah.
But like I say, I was not fast. Even going up the hill, I was not fast. And I've since gone back to that original set point of 152 pounds. And my performance has all but returned on the bike, which has been satisfactory to me.
While you're still on a ketogenic diet?
While still on a ketogenic diet, still regularly measuring above 0.5 millimole per liter of blood beta hydroxybutyrate. So
I know it's become really popular to evaluate a ketogenic diet for athletic performance. My suspicion and belief where it stands right now, and I have kind of less knowledge on the subject, is that that this diet is really better for longer endurance sports.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that you will see when you become fat adapted is, if you have increased mitochondrial biogenesis, is that you will be able to sustain a higher amount of oxygen consumption than you were before on a lower carbohydrate diet before you switch to more anaerobic systems, but that your peak power output is going to be limited ultimately. So you're sprinting and you're higher energy. It's rate limited by the even though you can produce more mitochondria. That's one way to kind of accommodate to that, to the lack of anaerobic efficiency. But ultimately, that the ability to produce energy rapidly from anaerobic metabolism is hindered significantly.
Right.
So I'm just not convinced that a ketogenic diet is better for most sports than a well-controlled, high-quality carbohydrate diet. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And absolutely. I would agree with you. And one of the nice things about being the host of this summit is that I can point people in the direction of another interview where we went into this topic in detail.
Yeah.
And, that would be with Mike T. Nelson, who is a PhD exercise physiologist. And we went into the topic of metabolic flexibility and how the ketogenic diet can assist with your exercise performance in detail. And that was an enlightening interview for me. I really enjoyed it, and it was his findings that he presented in the research were very consistent with my experience on the bike.
I can't wait to listen to it. Mike's a great guy, and real knowledgeable in the field. So I look forward to hearing that interview. Okay, so one thing that we've talked about is this importance of appetite regulation. And the Kevin Hall work was looking at, is there a metabolic advantage? That didn't seem to be a significant source of any potential advantage for a ketogenic diet. But what you do see is improvement in appetite regulation. And this has been shown multiple times. So one work by Priya Sumitran, she is at the University of Melbourne, she looked at over about 40 different non-diabetic, overweight, and obese subjects, and they had them lose weight on a very low energy diet and a ketogenic diet, and they lost about 13% of their body weight over that period of time, which is really significant. And what they found is that when you were in a ketogenic state, there was after you went out of ketosis, there was less of a weight loss induced increase in ghrelin. All right, and that's kind of like some double negatives. It gets confusing, but usually when you lose weight, there is an increase in ghrelin.
And that makes you more hungry.
That makes you more hungry. And I want to talk about ghrelin because it's generally spoken, a bit superficially, but it has a very powerful impact on food intake. And by the way, that work by Sumitharan was essentially supported by a meta-analysis that was done by Alice Gibson at the University of Sydney, where she looked at a variety of different studies and showed, indeed, there does seem to be a benefit to ketogenic diet, but there was also a benefit to a very low energy diet as well. So with a very low energy diet, there was less hunger and there was a reduced desire to eat. With a ketogenic diet, there was less hunger and greater satiety and fullness. So that's some nuance there, but it is speaking to different mechanisms that are controlling overall the amount of food that's actually being consumed. But if you think about what ghrelin is, it is a hormone that is released from what are called oxyntic cells within the gut. And it has very important effects. And to me, learning all the different effects have been quite surprising. So overall, it links nutrient partitioning with growth and repair processes. So your ability it induces hunger, makes you hungry, but then it has an ability to then affect different hormones. So increases gastric emptying, it facilitates nutrient storage, and it increases growth hormone release. So all of that, if you think about that, that makes a lot of sense. It makes you hungry, and then it helps actually partition the nutrients, and then it is also stimulating repair processes. You can see the coordination of our physiology there. But it's also having really important effects on the brain. And so those are the ones that have been a bit surprising to me. It impacts memory and depression. And really if you think about it, ghrelin is a stress hormone and it is released under stressful situations. So typically the release of it is what you call is episodic hormone, that it is low right after a meal, but as you get hours away from that meal, it starts to rise. And it is the only orexigenic hormone that is known to be found in the gut, meaning it's the only hormone that is released by the gut that is promoting feeding instead of a suppression of feeding. All other hormones that have been found are in response usually to food intake, and they're actually coordinating to help you feel full and to end your meal. So that's a really unique hormone in that regard. And so how does it promote, overeating and hunger? Well, there are receptors for ghrelin that are on various centers within the central nervous system. One of them is it increases dopamine within an area called the ventral tegmental area. Now, this area is part of the motivation and reward circuit, so it makes you more motivated to go and find food. And it also increases the rewarding properties of high-calorie foods. So it makes food look more appealing, and it makes you more energized to go and seek it. So now, why is this important? Well, typically with weight loss, you see 20%, you see very high rises in the amount of ghrelin beyond baseline. So you're in a ravenous state and you're energized to go find that food. And that makes a lot of sense. Your body is really trying to prevent you from starving. That's an anti-starvation mechanism. The other really important thing, though, is that ghrelin can be released under stressful situations. And about 80% of us will modify our eating behavior in response to stress. Half of those people, though, will eat less. Half will eat more. So the actual effect on behavior is different. But everybody, whether you're eating more or less, changes the type of food that they pursue. You go after comfort foods when you're in a stressful situation. So that is really, really, really interesting, to me when I saw that. And so this is one way that they look at this is they do something called a conditioned place preference test with animals. And what they do is they have an animal run around a chamber and they put high-fat foods on one side of the chamber and the animals love it. And in normal situations, then even if they remove the food, then the animal will spend more time in the side of the chamber where they found that high fat food. And what happens is when you are actually, if you inject ghrelin into an animal, you amplify this response. So it's showing you that like it changes how you live. You're going to be spending more time, and it's acting in a lot of very subconscious ways to guide food intake. And then once you've taken in that food, your motivation to find it, the type that you're going after, and then it's also enhancing partitioning. So the ability of ketones to suppress ghrelin is, I think, indicative of what's happening within the brain. But that is, to me, the reason why this is so exciting is that if you lose weight, you're not going to be in a state that's going to drive you back to a fat level that you had prior to making that huge effort to lose the weight in the first place. That to me is really, really exciting stuff.
It is exciting. And then, so is this the same means by which that people feel less hungry then? So when I say that I can maintain my body composition effortlessly, whereas before I was constantly thinking about food, is ghrelin one of the hormones that may be involved in that?
Yeah, very possibly. And I looked into this because I have a published paper looking at ghrelin levels in narcoleptics to further characterize their phenotype. So narcoleptics are a really interesting human model to look at because they're missing the orexin hypocretin system. And so it's a really interesting group to look at because it helps us understand, if how feeding might be, the different systems that are controlling feeding. But yeah, anyway, in writing about ghrelin for this research that I was a part of, it was, at that time, it was unknown about how ghrelin is specifically controlled, the release of it.
Right. And then so for people watching, and actually me too, so am I to take away from this information that a stressful situation would change my eating behavior?
Yeah. That is, in about 80% of people, stress changes eating behavior. And there's a study that they do to show that ghrelin is a stress hormone, and they call it a chronic social defeat. They take a mouse and they put it into a chamber with a bully mouse, and the bully mouse beats it up a little bit, and then they put it in this chamber. I know, it's so cruel. Chamber, but they put a glass window between them, so the mouse that was beaten up can see the bully mouse. And even just a short period of time with this level of stress, you see that the amount of ghrelin that is produced is increased substantially, and that increase lasts for 4 weeks. So it has a long-term influence on the amount of ghrelin that is.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, very useful information.
Yeah, and if you look at knockout mice with ghrelin knockout mice, there is no, you don't see that effect. So yeah, stressful situations, which is psychological stress, calorie restriction. These are things that can increase ghrelin. So that's what's going on. It seems that even though weight loss should be considered a stressful situation, ketones perhaps are making it not so stressful to the body.
Interesting. So I'm just trying to think if I can summarize this, all this information for people. We started out talking about how parts of the brain can be remodeled in different ways with different types of diet.
Yep.
That the ketogenic diet may be advantageous in that respect.
That's right.
And then you talked about palmitic acid and how that might be a problem for some people, although there's not a good way for us to figure out who are the people that have a problem with some of these saturated fatty acids. Is that a correct summarization there?
Yeah, I think we're going to increasingly have access to nutrigenomic platforms that are going to tell us.
They're going to get better.
Yeah, they're going to, you don't necessarily have to look at the hypothalamus specifically, but you might get an indication of your ability to process saturated fatty acids well by, again,
looking at some secondary markers, maybe
other systems in the body that are that indicate whether or not this is a fat that you can handle well.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. And then you presented some data on the Mediterranean diet where you showed that a ketogenic diet gave the best weight loss, and that slowed when they reintroduced some carbohydrates. But then more importantly, they maintained when they switched to a Mediterranean diet. And that may be a good strategy for anyone who's looking to lose weight and then keep it off.
And one thing that we didn't mention is that when I do a ketogenic diet, I make it more Mediterranean in nature. So I'm not doing a lot of animal fats, salami, and dairy. Although I do have yogurt. I have what I do is I do more monounsaturated fat. So avocado mayonnaise and olive oil in fish. So that is, I'm eating more like that when I do my ketogenic diet.
And the fish, I think, is super important. I mean, because there are essential fatty acids that are only in cold water fatty fish. So I think those are foods that anyone should be eating.
Yeah, it's funny. My ketogenic diet looks similar to my, Mediterranean style diet. I just add a lot more fat, and I actually take out things that I ordinarily eat. So it's similar, but it's some food on the plate and the amount of macronutrients shift a bit temporarily. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, Human OS Radio, I would highly recommend again. And where can people find more of your tools? So you mentioned the Ideal Weight Program. Where can people find that?
Yeah, we have wrote a free ebook if you want to read more about it. Go to Twitter at Dan's Plan Health, and in there in our Twitter profile, there's a link to that ebook which you can take a look.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think I still have that up there. I might have replaced it with Human OS Radio. I have to check. Or you can go to dansplan.com, click on the Ideal Weight Program, and there's a way to download the book from there as well and check it out. So if you want to read more, there's also, I would look at some of Stephan Guyenet's work where he's writing about, the factors that that are kind of involved in how we constructed the diet as well. So yeah, Dan's Plan, Human OS Radio, and at Dan's Plan Health. All of this is going to be Human OS oriented soon when we switch over. But if you go to Dan's Plan now and we've already switched, it'll just redirect you. So you're safe either way.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate you. This has been great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. I love being on the show. I can't wait to watch all the other interviews too.
Thank you.
Yeah.